My name is Elena Cabral, and I'm an administrator and a member of the adjunct faculty. And I'm pleased to present the Paul Tobenkin Award. This is a prize for outstanding achievement in reporting on racial and religious hatred, intolerance, and discrimination in the United States. It was created in 1959 to honor the work of Paul Tobenkin, a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune during the Civil Rights era. This year, the winner of the Tobenkin Prize is Terrence McCoy, a reporter at the Washington Post, and as it happens, a 2012 graduate of our MA program. The story of Freddie Gray's death while in custody of the Baltimore police last year became known to the whole nation. But less familiar was his troubled childhood as a victim of lead poisoning. Terry chased that part of the story and discovered that Gray had sold hundreds of thousands of dollars of a legal settlement he received to a financial company called Access Funding in exchange for a lump cash payout that amounted to just dimes on the dollar. Companies like this make up a largely unregulated settlement purchasing industry in Maryland that has profited off of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens, mostly poor residents, many suffering from mental health issues, and several lacking legal representation. McCoy uncovered scores of other similar cases of victims who received pennies on the dollar for their settlements, while companies like Access Funding reaped the windfall in highly questionable transactions. The reporting led to swift actions by the state and cast a spotlight on a troubling practice. Maryland's Attorney General launched an investigation into the settlement purchasing industry, and state legislation was introduced that would put new requirements on these purchases. Maryland's highest court also approved measures that would dramatically change how companies buy the rights to structured settlements. Unfortunately, Terry could not be here to accept the award in person. Somehow, in the midst of all the great work he does covering poverty and social justice, he found time to get married and is currently away on his honeymoon. I know, right? The nerve. We wish him the very best, both in his marriage and in his already luminous career. Happily, the finalists for the Tobenkin Award are here, giving us the pleasure and privilege to describe this groundbreaking investigation called Environmental Justice Denied. While it's no secret that communities of color have long been burdened by the placement of sewage plants, incinerators, landfills, and pesticide spraying in their neighborhoods, the exhaustive analysis by this team of reporters showed that the Environmental Protection Agency's Civil Rights Office, which was established to protect these communities from environmental injustice, had remained largely inactive, despite hundreds of serious claims it received over its 22-year history. Reporters pored over thousands of pages of complaint documents and made them accessible to the public to trace this inaction online. And they did not stop with a paper trail. They fanned out to communities across the U.S. to hear from residents about how these toxic facilities had damaged their lives. This series resulted in a wave of additional news coverage and prompted the EPA to take steps to reform its Civil Rights Office. The nominated reporters on this project were Kristen Lombardi, Talia Buford, and Ronnie Green of the Center for Public Integrity, and Amber Payne of NBC BLK, and John Brecher of NBC News. With us today to acknowledge this honor is Ms. Buford and Ms. Lombardi, reporters at CPI. Talia.
Thank you to Columbia University and the award judges. We really appreciate the citation that we were given. It does mean more than you could possibly ever know. As a nation, we decided a half a century ago that treating people differently because of the color of their skin wasn't something that we would tolerate. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. One of the law's provisions, Title VI, prohibits discrimination by any entity receiving federal financial aid. The purpose is to ensure that the government isn't inadvertently funding discriminatory practices. It's a powerful law, and in some instances, it has borne fruit. But the execution of civil rights law has been far from perfect. When it comes to the environment, we've allowed the gatekeeper of that law, the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Civil Rights, to sidestep its responsibility, leaving citizens with no recourse against dirty air, polluted water, and other environmental hazards that they may face. This series, Environmental Justice Denied, was born out of a conversation that Kristen had where a source casually mentioned that the EPA, despite all of its rhetoric, has a little-known history of not enforcing civil rights law. Neither of us have even heard of the Civil Rights Office, so we talked to the environmental justice advocates and filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the EPA to examine its record. We spent most of 2015 poring over thousands of pages of documents detailing every Title VI complaint submitted to the EPA's Civil Rights Office over the last 2 decades and every resolution to those complaints. We found an office paralyzed by inaction. 9 times out of 10, environmental discrimination claims were dismissed or rejected by the EPA. Only 12 cases have been closed with any kind of official action, and 17 communities that filed complaints have been waiting in limbo, some for more than a decade, while the agency reviews those claims. The agency has never issued a formal civil rights violation in its 23-year history. These numbers reveal a woeful enforcement record, but we wanted to put a face on the victims. So we went around the country to Louisiana, Alabama, California, New York, New Mexico, and Ohio. And we talked to the residents behind the complaints. They've been forced to live next to pesticide-covered fields, noxious sewage plants, and other environmental hazards. We sat in living rooms and listened to their stories. We went to Uniontown, Alabama, which is just outside of Selma, where residents complained that a landfill was deliberately sited across a 2-lane road from their homes, and that 4 million tons of coal ash was placed in a community from a spill that was from a more affluent white neighborhood. We heard them talk about how they begged government officials to listen. When we interviewed them, they were thankful to be heard. Since our series, the EPA has taken steps to reform its Civil Rights Office. It's released a draft plan and is proposing a rule to address some of the systemic issues that we exposed. We took these steps as a sign that our reporting was significant enough to move this vast, historically intractable federal agency. The residents of Uniontown, meanwhile, are still waiting for EPA to finish investigating their claims. They're still waiting for agency officials to listen. I came to understand the importance of listening after this series ran. I grew up in a place a lot like the ones I now cover, Flint, Michigan. You may have heard of it. It's a city now pretty well known for the lead-tainted water flowing through its taps. As the water crisis there unfolded, I recognized a familiar refrain from those residents. They told officials for months that something was wrong, and no one listened, sometimes not even journalists. My mother still lives in Flint, and when she first raised concerns about the water, I brushed them off as standard dysfunction in my hometown. As the crisis made national news, I took a moment to examine my own blind spots and consider what other stories I had missed because they didn't rise to the level of what I thought was important. As you go into the journalism world, with its deadlines and other daily pressures, it will be easy to ignore these stories. They are not sexy. They are not easy. And often, they're not clear-cut. They may involve hulking government bureaucracies that will take years to set right. And if, like me, you grew up in a place where these sorts of hardships are part of everyday life, it may be difficult to recognize the injustice of it all. It may be easier to recognize the plight of people unknown. Do not ignore your own story for the sake of impartiality. Your history and perspective matter. They are important. I'd admonish you to do 2 things as you go into the world, no matter where your career takes you. Listen and care. Listen to the people that society has written off. Listen to those whom the government has dismissed. Listen to what isn't being said, what promises aren't being kept, and who is being left behind. Listen to your voicemail, and consider every tip, no matter how big or how small. Listen to your heart, hear your gut. Put yourself in the shoes of those being ignored. You'll be a better reporter for doing so. Thank you.